I recently built this robotic finger that is controlled by a stepper motor. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best choice. In order to get the motor to move the finger, I had to set the current higher. And after only a short while, the motor heated up, and the plastic parts deformed. So I ordered some servos and rebuilt the finger. I'll redraw and print all the parts again. I only managed 3 parts today. The first and second finger links and the rod. Here you can already see the installation of the bearings and the small shaft for the rod. I simply soldered the end to keep it from falling out. For the second link, I also installed the bearings, plus 2 M3 nuts, that the bolt that connects the second link will go through. Over the last 2 days, I have managed to draw the remaining parts of the finger and create the assembly. After that, all I had to do was print the parts and start assembling. That took me about another hour of my time. And here you can already see the result. In the following days, I would like to finish the other fingers and gradually start creating the palm. Today, I managed to finish the attachment for the second finger. Since I'm running out of gray filament, all the parts will now be gold. After printing, I set about assembling it. For the first finger attachment, I adjusted the dimensions slightly to better fit the second finger servo. Unfortunately, I miscalculated a bit when drawing it, so I had to slightly adjust one part with a soldering iron. And here you can already see the overall progress. I managed to finish my second finger today. After some 3D printing, I cleaned up the parts and assembled them. With a minor hitch on one axis, it took me about an hour. Over the weekend, I'd like to finish the other 2 fingers and tackle the thumb. I've already modeled my entire palm, including the fingers except for the thumb. But today, I only managed to print a part of the palm and a few modified parts of the controls for the fingers themselves. It's these screws that are sticking out awkwardly, plus my servo mount is still cracking. And here, after a little cleaning of the parts and the actual assembly, you can see the actual shift. The bolts are no longer visible, except for the front ones. I need to shorten those as well, but that's for next time. I'm already starting to work on my thumb. In the last 2 days, I've only managed to print parts for the middle finger. I'm a little delayed in getting it together. Since a piece of the printed part broke during assembly, I had to print it again. As you may notice, I also shortened the front screws on the finger controls, so they won't stick out and snag on other parts unnecessarily. I haven't made much progress in the last 2 days. I finished the thumb prototype. It's not perfect yet, but I plan to redo it anyway. I have not managed to print and assemble it anymore, so I at least assembled the pinky I had left, and here you can already see the current progress. I finally had time to finish my thumb. After a short print, assembly followed. Unfortunately, I thought I had more servos, but that was not the case. Thus, I used 1 servo from the pinky. In addition, I didn't pay much attention during the modeling process, so I had to modify a few parts after the fact. The following days, I would like to work on the wrist and redo the thumb. I will modify the palm itself when I have the wrist finished. Today, we have a little upgrade. I had a few parts that didn't fit on my thumb, so I modified them. It's a servo armhole that is no longer made with a soldering iron, and the part that makes the finger move, where the parts were rubbing against each other. Everything fits now. Next, I started working on the wrist. This is going to be rather tricky as I would like to maintain movement in all directions. I currently have a finished prototype wrist. I had a problem with the supports while cleaning the parts, but in the end I got it right. I had to sand, cut, or adjust a few parts with a soldering iron during assembly. This is the part where I had a small pitch, and I also forgot to make a hole for the servo cable. As you can see, the wrist can handle movement in 2 directions so far. I'd figure out the whole palm rotation later. The actual attachment of the wrist to the palm will not look like this. When modifying the palm, I'd like to get to that shape, but we'll save that for next time. Since I plan on redesigning my palm for the wrist attachment, I decided to order stronger servos with metal gears. Because they are longer, I will have to repaint more parts. So far, I have only been able to remake the index finger mount, where I also focused on the servo attachment, as this part was cracking a lot. I created a simple rib on both sides. Next, I decided to use the servo lever provided and incorporate it into the printed part. I've also managed to get the finger moving, but more on that next time. I forgot that as the distance from the center of rotation of the servo increases, the torque decreases. Then, when I moved my finger slowly, at some point the servo had no power and jammed. In the case of smooth, fast movement, everything was fine. So I did some tests with a smaller distance from the center where the slow movement didn't cause such problems anymore, so I'll have to redesign the finger control itself. I currently have a 2-to-1 leverage mechanism. This means that when the servo shaft is rotated 180 degrees, the finger is tilted 90 degrees, and already at low speed there is no jamming. It's just that my finger didn't fully extend. I will have to reprint the parts. They are already worn from constant testing. I reprinted and reassembled the index finger as its mechanism no longer worked as it should. At the same time, I made some minor changes. First of all, I shortened the cable from the servo to the necessary length so that it no longer got in the way. Next time, I plan to tackle the palm and wiring. Today, we're going to take a look at the modified palm. The most time-consuming part was removing the supports. Since I want the droid to be modular, the parts can be easily separated. I have to adapt the wiring to that. To connect the servo to the control electronics, I will use a 3-pin rail on one side of the palm and a 6-pin connector on the other. All the wiring will then be hidden on the back. I haven't made much progress, though. I was only able to power the wires to the 3-pin rail, and then I started on the connector. Unfortunately, my solder station died in the process. My soldering iron finally arrived, so I could continue building the droid. I've only managed to make the middle finger so far. In addition, I shortened the servo so that the bottom of the finger is flush and there are no holes in the palm. I also modified the servo lever. I needed to make the screw-through for better force transfer. After installing the index and middle fingers in the palm of my hand, I found that the fingers had a problem with movement. They are getting stuck either on the palm or the servo. Therefore, I redesigned the servo lever mount so that the bolt is reversed and doesn't stick its head into the servo. At the same time, I slightly modified some parts of the palm with a soldering iron, and as you can see, everything works as it should. Today I managed to finish only the ring finger. The assembly itself went without a problem, only with the servo, where I shortened the cable to the required length. Instead of cutting the wire and putting the connector on, chose the route of opening the servo, unsoldering the cable, shortening it to the required length, and resoldering. And here you can already see the movement of the ring finger. I haven't made much progress. I set about assembling the pinky and soon had it done. After installing the pinky in the palm of my hand, I tested the finger and found that the servo would not move. I removed it and tested it again. It looks like the servo is dead, or I have miswired the cables. Today, I set about wiring my palm. First, I soldered the wires to the 3-pin rails and inserted them into the palm, which took me almost an hour. Then I connected the power to the individual servos and soldered them together with the PWM to the 8-pin connector. From the front, we can see the connectors for the servos and then the wires from the back. Tomorrow, I will test the connections, fill with glue and cover. I did a wiring test and everything went fine, so I filled the wiring space with glue using a hot melt gun. Then all I had to do was print the cover. Since I didn't have glue to stick the cover on, I improvised and simply soldered the cover with plastic using a soldering iron. Finally, I wrote a simple program and tested it with my fingers. It's not quite right, but it's progress. I'm currently working on my thumb. The actual printing and assembly went fine. I will be using 2 servos to control the thumb. One to tilt the thumb, and the other to bend it. I still need to modify the servo cable as it is too short. But I'll save that for next time, as well as testing the whole palm. Before I got to this stage, I first had to adjust the thumb servo cable to the required length. Then I just wrote the code, which includes a simple finger calibration and this beautiful gesture. I finally had time to get to the wrist. I'm out of gold filament, so I'll be using green. By rotating the servo 90 degrees, I was able to fit one more servo while keeping the same dimensions as the prototype. At the same time, I made some minor changes. For example, I incorporated the servo arm into the printed part to prevent it from spinning. I've also figured out the wiring, but we'll talk about that later. Today I managed to connect my wrist to my hand. I didn't experience any problems during the actual printing and assembly, so I could easily separate the palm from the wrist. I printed and soldered this part to the palm. I avoided redoing the entire palm. On one side of the part, I recessed the supplied servo arm, and on the other side is an M3 bolt going into the bearing. And here you can already see the actual progress. I was kind of hoping that the servo used would be strong enough to tighten the whole palm, but as you can see, it's not, and the palm of the hand is easily outweighed by the servo. I ran some tests. On empty and with a light load, everything is fine, so I'll have to order a stronger servo. My droid won't be controlled by artificial intelligence like Tesla's robot or hard-programmed like Boston's products, but it will be controlled by a human being. I've designed and built this prototype so far. When I move my finger, the potentiometer rotates. This movement is then transmitted to the servo, as you can see. Since I used an older program, the finger moves in the opposite direction and in a small range, so I will have to write a new program. I'm currently working on controlling the droid. I've improved the grip and extended it with additional fingers. I'm using a simple potentiometer to control it. I've already chosen a better one, but it's considerably more expensive, so I'll stick with the regular version for this one. I'm working on my wrist now. I wanted to solve the two movements that the droid handles. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. To avoid having to redo this part, I printed simple paw prints for this part that fit nicely. As for the wrist, it is made up of two parts that attach the mechanism to the hand and a potentiometer. I then put another piece with a potentiometer on it. This was to provide both movements, but unfortunately, it doesn't work. It took me a while, but I finally solved the problem. As you can see, you can now move your wrist in both directions, so I still have to fit the design with a second potentiometer, but I will do that next time, as well as a minor modification of the parts. Before I get into redoing the controls for the entire droid palm, I decided to go for the thumb. The movement itself will be handled by two potentiometers. This one will be responsible for the movement of the entire thumb. The other will move part of it. As you can see, I've been shitting on the aesthetics quite a bit. The idea was just to test how it might work before I redesigned the controls. I set about rebuilding the droid controls. One part didn't print well, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. I managed to incorporate these parts into one. Here is the potentiometer to control the thumb. On the other side will be the wrist control. Next, I shrunk this part. It pushed quite a bit when moving and would not bend the whole finger. Unfortunately, this was a fatal flaw. As you can see, this modification makes the part travel more. Similarly to the droid palm, I will combine the individual connectors into one. So I printed out a small box and started soldering. I will use a pin strip for the input and an 8-pin connector for the output. 2 pins will take up the power supply, the rest is for signal transmission. It took me quite a bit of work to get everything connected. Next time I'm gonna start making a circuit board. I tested the box before sealing it with glue and then attached it to the control mechanism. Next time I will fit the potentiometers with connectors and connect them. Today I decided to connect the potentiometers to the box. First, I cut the wires to the required length, stripped the ends and put on the tubes. I then plugged them into the 3-pin connector. I also stripped the other end and finally tinned it. Then all that was left was to solder the wires to the potentiometers. While testing each potentiometer, I found that one connector was not working. Since the last time I didn't like the modified part, I decided to redo it again. I'll do the remaining fingers in a similar vein. The actual printing and assembly went without a problem. As you can see, the finger can be moved much better already. This is thanks to the fact that I made the part wider and narrower at the bottom, so that the finger can be fully bent. It's not quite right, but for my purposes, it will be sufficient. Last time, I was able to do the index finger control. Today, I've taken on the other fingers. Basically, I just slightly modified each part to fit each finger. I printed them out and assembled them. I'm happy with the result. A couple of parts could use some minor cosmetic changes, but I'll leave it at that. As you can see, there is a slight indentation in a couple of places after taking the controls off. I would like to address this in the future.